At one point, there was no debate. Aya Wilson wasn't just the best player in the league, she was the league. Her name didn't come up in conversations about greatness. It ended them. MVP trophies weren't milestones for her anymore, they were expectations. Championships didn't feel like achievements, they felt like confirmation. Every season reinforced the same message. This was her era, and everyone else was just passing through it. When fans talked about dominance in women's basketball, they weren't imagining hypotheticals. They were watching it in real time. Wilson controlled games without rushing. She dictated matchups, bent defensive schemes, and forced entire teams to adjust their identity just to survive against her. Analysts didn't question if she'd show up. They discussed how badly she'd overwhelm whoever stood in front of her. That level of control does something dangerous to a person. It creates the belief that what you've built is permanent. Off the court, the message was even louder. Brand deals rolled in effortlessly. Media coverage treated her like a fixture, not a feature. She wasn't framed as a star who needed protecting. She was the standard everyone else was measured against. Interviews assumed her leadership. Headlines assumed her relevance. Nothing suggested that the spotlight would ever drift. And why would it? She had done everything the right way. Years of development, championship pedigree, international experience, respect from veterans and coaches alike. This wasn't a flash of hype or a social media-fueled rise. This was the long game paying off exactly as promised. So when attention started shifting, even slightly, it didn't feel like competition. It felt like theft. From Wilson's perspective, there was an unspoken hierarchy in women's basketball. You earned your place through time, sacrifice, and dominance. You didn't skip steps. You didn't leapfrog legends. And you definitely didn't walk into the conversation without proving yourself against professionals who had already paid their dues. That belief mattered because it shaped how she interpreted everything that came next. To Wilson, the spotlight wasn't something you shared freely. It was something you defended. Because once you've reached the top, maintaining control becomes part of your identity. Losing influence doesn't feel like evolution, it feels like erasure. And that's the mindset she carried into a league that was about to change faster than anyone expected. Because while Wilson believed she was standing on solid ground, something else was building momentum far beyond the hardwood. Something that didn't ask permission. Something that didn't wait its turn. And by the time she realized what was happening, the conversation was already moving on without her. But that realization didn't arrive all at once. It arrived quietly, and then all at once. What made Caitlin Clark different wasn't just talent. Plenty of players arrive with skill. Plenty put up numbers. Plenty have short bursts where the spotlight flirts with them before moving on. Clark wasn't that. She didn't climb the ladder rung by rung. She replaced the ladder entirely. Her rise didn't feel gradual. It felt disruptive. One moment, women's basketball followed familiar rhythms, predictable markets, expected stars, controlled narratives. The next, arenas that had struggled to fill seats were sold out weeks in advance. Television executives weren't asking how to grow ratings anymore. They were asking how to handle the sudden surge. Clips of her shots weren't circulating just among basketball fans. They were breaking containment, landing on timelines of people who had never watched a full women's game before. And that's when things became uncomfortable. Clark wasn't being promoted. She was being pulled upward by demand. Fans didn't need explanations. They didn't need campaigns. They saw the range, the confidence, the audacity. They saw someone pulling up from distances defenders weren't supposed to guard, making shots that looked reckless until they splashed clean through the net. They saw fearlessness without arrogance, swagger without explanation. And that combination is rare. What truly separated Clark, though, wasn't just how she played. It was how she made people feel watching her. Games didn't feel instructional or slow. They felt electric. Every possession carried anticipation. Every logo range pull-up had the crowd leaning forward before the ball even left her hands. Attention followed instinctively. Suddenly, conversations shifted. Not deliberately, organically. Broadcasters led with her highlights. Sports debates centered on her impact rather than her resume. The league wasn't trying to anoint a new face. Audiences already had. And once that happens, control disappears. That's the part veterans often underestimate. You can dominate your peers and still lose the moment. You can own statistics and still lose the narrative. And narratives matter more than anything when leagues grow. Clark's presence didn't shrink the league, it expanded it. New fans arrived who weren't invested in legacy debates. They didn't care who had paid dues or how long someone had ruled. They cared about excitement. They cared about moments. They cared about the feeling that something special was unfolding in front of them. For someone like Wilson, that shift wasn't neutral. Because while Clark was attracting new attention, Wilson wasn't losing skill, she was losing exclusivity. The spotlight that once belonged to her alone was now being shared with someone who hadn't followed the traditional path to stardom. And that distinction mattered deeply. In Wilson's world, respect came from longevity and dominance. In Clark's world, respect came from impact, immediate, undeniable impact. The two value systems collided without warning, and there was no referee to slow things down. Media coverage reflected it almost instantly. Clark's name began leading segments instead of trailing them. Her highlights weren't framed as impressive for her age. They were framed as must-see moments. Interviews stopped asking when she'd be ready. They asked how defenses could possibly stop her. And that's when the dynamic changed completely. Because Clark wasn't chasing Wilson. Wilson was watching Clark. Every new record broken, every viral clip, every sold-out crowd added pressure that couldn't be spoken out loud. It wasn't jealousy in the cartoon sense. It was something more subtle and more dangerous. The realization that control was slipping, and there was no obvious way to stop it. The most unsettling part? Clark wasn't provoking anyone. She wasn't calling out veterans. She wasn't demanding status. She wasn't campaigning for attention. She played, she spoke carefully, and she let the noise build around her naturally. That restraint made her impossible to attack directly without looking insecure. And insecurity is the one thing dominant figures are trained never to reveal. So instead of confrontation, the tension went underground. Instead of open conflict, it manifested in tone, in timing, in phrasing, in moments that could always be dismissed individually, but told a much louder story when viewed together. And that's where the real damage began. Because when someone feels their position is being threatened, they don't always strike immediately. Sometimes they test the ground first. And what happened next was subtle enough that most people missed it, but deliberate enough that it couldn't be accidental. At first, nothing looked wrong. There were no public blow-ups, no direct call-outs, no explosive interviews demanding attention. Everything stayed just subtle enough to dismiss, which is exactly why it worked for a while. This is how modern conflicts begin. A carefully timed comment here. A reaction that felt slightly off there. A shift in tone that only stood out if you were paying close attention. To most fans, it was nothing. To people inside the league, it felt different. Because once Caitlin Clark's rise stopped looking temporary, the messaging changed. Wilson didn't come out and attack her outright. That would have been reckless. Instead, she leaned into implication. Language started doing the heavy lifting. Phrases like sustained excellence and proven impact appeared more frequently in interviews, always delivered calmly, always framed as general statements. On the surface, they sounded reasonable. Underneath, they drew a line between who belonged at the top and who was just visiting. The timing of those comments mattered. They didn't show up randomly. They surfaced right after Clark hit milestones, right after record-breaking performances, right after moments where the spotlight felt like it had shifted just a little too far. The pattern became difficult to ignore once you stopped looking at each moment in isolation. Social media amplified it without making it obvious. A post highlighting past dominance appeared within hours of Clark trending. Old highlights resurfaced with captions about real work and earned respect. Nothing aggressive, nothing explicit, just enough to reassert hierarchy without naming names. That's the thing about quiet resentment. It doesn't shout, it signals. And those signals were received loud and clear by fans who understood the subtext. Debates flared in comment sections. Comparisons that hadn't existed before suddenly dominated timelines. Instead of celebrating growth in the sport, conversations shifted toward rivalry. Not because Clark asked for it, but because the tension demanded it. Wilson, intentionally or not, was framing Clark as a test rather than an asset. Interviews grew more pointed. Praise became conditional. Compliments arrived wrapped in qualifiers. Clark was acknowledged, but always with a reminder that dominance, at the highest level, was different. The implication lingered. Let's see how this holds up when things get real. The problem with that approach? Clark kept delivering anyway. Each time Wilson's tone suggested limits, Clark pushed past them. Each time doubts were implied, Clark responded on the court. And because Clark never responded verbally, the contrast grew sharper. One side looked defensive. The other looked focused. That imbalance matters more than people realize. Fans don't just watch games, they watch reactions. They track who feels threatened and who feels inevitable. And slowly, perception began shifting in ways Wilson couldn't control. What started as a quiet attempt to protect status began to look like resistance to change. And resistance, especially from established figures, always draws scrutiny. Behind the scenes, league officials and selectors noticed too. Not because they cared about drama, but because they care about chemistry. Because every comment, every subtle dig, every moment of visible frustration tells a story about how someone handles pressure when things stop going their way. Wilson likely believed she was standing her ground. What she didn't realize was that each small moment was adding up, not as evidence of strength, but as documentation of discomfort. And discomfort at the top raises questions no amount of accolades can erase. Meanwhile, Clark stayed out of it completely. No quotes, no counters, no energy spent defending her place. She let performance speak, and silence do the rest. That silence became powerful. It made every reaction around her louder by comparison. And that's when the narrative crossed a dangerous line. Because once a dominant figure is seen as reacting instead of leading, authority begins to crack. What looked like confidence started resembling insecurity. What felt like leadership began looking personal. And the league, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not, was watching a shift happen in real time. But the most critical observers weren't fans or commentators. They were the people responsible for choosing who represents the country when the pressure is highest. And they were taking notes. There's a moment in every dominant career where the game stops asking what you've done and starts asking what you can still become. Some players adapt. Others resist. Aya Wilson had spent years operating in an environment that reinforced her authority. Success followed predictability. The league knew her. Referees knew her. Defenses knew her. That familiarity wasn't just comfort, it was leverage. It allowed her to play with certainty, knowing the system bent in ways that rewarded her style. But Caitlin Clark didn't enter that system. She disrupted it. Clark's game didn't rely on rhythm provided by the flow of play or the favor of officiating. It was independent, self-sustaining, built on spacing, anticipation, and shots that couldn't be neutralized by strategy alone. You couldn't scheme her into silence. You couldn't slow her down by tightening rules or physicality. Her offense existed outside the traditional power structure. That difference created an invisible divide. Wilson's dominance came from mastery within the system. Clark's impact came from stretching the system until it had to adjust around her. One approach thrives on control. The other thrives on chaos. And chaos terrifies those who built their legacy on order. As Clark's influence grew, Wilson faced a choice she never expected to confront. Adapt to a league evolving around a new type of star, or defend the version of the league that made her untouchable in the first place. Everything suggests she chose defense. Not loudly, not dramatically, but emotionally. Instead of leaning into mentorship, her tone suggested separation. Instead of embracing expansion, her language emphasized hierarchy. She spoke as someone protecting something rather than building something new. That posture matters more than statistics ever will. Because elite organizations, especially national teams, don't just evaluate talent. They evaluate elasticity. They look for players who absorb change without fracturing, who can handle being one of many instead of the one. Wilson struggled with that shift. Every moment of Clark's rise felt like an erosion of certainty. The rules were changing without warning. The audience was changing without asking. And worst of all, the attention was moving in a direction Wilson couldn't redirect. Adaptation would have required humility. It would have meant accepting that the league was no longer centered around a single axis. That stardom was becoming decentralized. That her role, while still elite, was no longer exclusive. But adaptation is hardest for those who never needed it before. So instead of evolving, Wilson leaned into entitlement. Not consciously, but structurally. Her reactions suggested she still believed her position should be protected. That influence should be preserved. That the system owed her stability because of what she'd already accomplished. The problem? Elite systems don't operate on nostalgia. They operate on projection. Team USA selectors, coaches, and analysts weren't asking who had ruled the past. They were asking who could survive the future. Who could walk into hostile environments, absorb pressure, adjust on the fly, and elevate others without making it personal. And quietly, Wilson's profile stopped matching that vision. Clark's did. Clark's refusal to engage publicly wasn't passive, it was strategic. It showed discipline, emotional restraint, an understanding that attention is a resource, and not every provocation deserves a response. Those traits are invaluable in international play, where chaos is constant and composure is currency. While Wilson appeared increasingly reactive, Clark appeared increasingly inevitable. That contrast didn't need commentary. It spoke for itself. By the time conversations reached official decision-makers, the question wasn't whether Clark belonged. It was whether Wilson still fit. And that question, once raised, cannot be unanswered. Because the moment ego overrides adaptability, the clock starts ticking. And soon, that clock would reach zero. What most fans never realize is that international basketball doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care how many MVPs you've won. It doesn't care how loud the crowd gets when your name is announced. And it definitely doesn't care about the narratives built around you in domestic leagues. On the international stage, there are no safety nets. The rules shift. The pace changes. The physicality intensifies. Referees don't reward reputation, they reward continuation. Contact that earns whistles at home gets waved off abroad. Plays that stop the game domestically turn into nothing more than background noise in international competition. That difference alone has ended careers people thought were bulletproof. Aya Wilson's dominance was never questioned in the WNBA. But dominance built inside one ecosystem doesn't always survive exposure to another. Her game thrives on rhythm and control, on initiating contact, forcing defenders into compromised positions, and leveraging officiating tendencies to maintain scoring flow. International play dismantles that advantage. When whistles disappear, efficiency matters. When defenders are allowed to be physical without interruption, adaptability becomes essential. And when games swing wildly in short windows, players must create offense that cannot be taken away. Team USA scouts noticed something unsettling. In international exhibitions and evaluations, Wilson's production didn't just dip, it flattened. When defenders held their ground and officials let plays continue, her offensive rhythm stalled. Drives that normally ended at the line ended in traffic. Post-ups became battles instead of advantages. The control she was used to evaporated. That doesn't make her weak. It makes her specialized. And specialization is risky when representing a country on the world stage. Now contrast that with Caitlin Clark. Clark's scoring doesn't depend on permission. No whistle can erase a 30-foot pull-up. No defensive contact neutralizes a step-back released before help arrives. Her offense doesn't ask for space, it creates it. It doesn't wait for rhythm, it manufactures it. International defenses hate that. Because you can't scheme against audacity. You can't referee it away. You can't slow it down without overcommitting. And once you do, she finds someone else. Clark's game travels. That single reality changed everything. Team USA wasn't choosing a highlight package. They were choosing reliability under chaos. They were choosing players who wouldn't unravel when calls stopped going their way. Who wouldn't freeze waiting for whistles that never come. Who could adjust instantly without frustration leaking into body language. Wilson's frustration showed. Not in tantrums, in hesitation. In moments where she expected relief and didn't get it. In glances toward officials that went unanswered. In pauses that shouldn't exist at that level. Scouts don't miss those details. They document them. They note who adapts mid-possession and who waits for the game to slow back down. They track emotional regulation just as closely as shot charts. Because international competition is unforgiving, emotionally and physically. Clark passed those tests early. She played the same way regardless of environment. Loud crowd or quiet gym. Friendly whistles or hostile officiating. Her approach didn't change, and neither did her confidence. That consistency is gold to national selectors. And slowly, quietly, the evaluation tilted. This wasn't about disrespecting Wilson's legacy. It was about acknowledging a mismatch between her game and the environment she was being asked to dominate. Team USA didn't need dominance that required accommodation. They needed dominance that survives neglect. And once that distinction became clear, the decision wasn't controversial internally. It was inevitable. What no one outside the room knew yet was how hard that inevitability would land, or how explosive the reaction would be once the truth could no longer be hidden. The announcement didn't come with drama. No press conference. No warning shot. No gradual softening of the blow. Just a list. Clean. Official. Final. And one name was missing. For someone like Aya Wilson, that absence hit harder than any loss ever could. Because this wasn't about minutes or matchups. This wasn't about rotation politics. This was about identity. About the belief that certain doors stayed open no matter what, because of who you were and what you'd already done. When Team USA released its preliminary roster, Wilson wasn't just left off a team. She was left out of the future. According to people close to the situation, the reaction was immediate and intense. Not confusion, outrage. Not disappointment, disbelief. This wasn't something she had prepared for emotionally because, in her mind, it simply wasn't possible. Dominant players don't get replaced. They get accommodated. They get worked around. They get protected. Except this time, none of that happened. Phone calls went out fast. The kind of calls made when someone believes a mistake has been made, not a decision. Conversations weren't framed around improvement or next steps. They were framed around explanations, around justification, around why this couldn't be real. But it was. Behind closed doors, the message was calm and unyielding. Evaluations had been made. Direction had been set. The staff had already moved forward. There was no emergency meeting coming to restore balance. No quiet reversal waiting behind the scenes. And that's when the emotional fallout began to leak. Publicly, the response was controlled, carefully worded, vague references to timing, priorities, and focus. But nobody really bought it. The tone didn't match the reality. It sounded like damage control, not clarity. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark's reaction couldn't have been more different. There were no victory laps, no pointed remarks, no subtle digs, just gratitude, appreciation, acknowledgement of the opportunity, and respect for the process. She didn't frame it as validation. She framed it as responsibility. That contrast spoke louder than any statement ever could. Because in moments like these, selectors don't just watch who gets chosen. They watch how players respond when things don't go their way. They watch for emotional discipline, for restraint, for maturity under disappointment. Wilson's response raised alarms. Not because she was upset, that's human, but because the frustration felt personal rather than professional. The messaging suggested entitlement rather than hunger. It felt like someone reacting to loss of status, not loss of opportunity. And that distinction matters deeply at the international level. Team USA isn't just assembling talent. It's assembling trust. Coaches need to know that when pressure hits, and it always hits, players won't implode, won't fracture the locker room, won't turn inward. Wilson's reaction confirmed the fears that had been quietly building for months. This wasn't about one decision gone wrong. It was about how someone handles being told no for the first time in years. And what happens when control disappears without warning. The irony was impossible to ignore. For 2 years, Wilson had treated Clark's rise as a threat, something to resist, something to undermine subtly. And now, in one moment, that same player had taken the exact spot Wilson believed was untouchable. Not through politics, not through noise, but through alignment with where the game was going. The meltdown didn't change minds. If anything, it solidified them. Because nothing confirms a decision like the reaction to it. Team USA staff didn't see someone ready to respond with focus and growth. They saw someone struggling to accept reality. Someone who viewed selection as owed rather than earned anew each cycle. And on the world stage, that mindset is fatal. By the time public explanations surfaced, the internal conclusion was already sealed. This wasn't a temporary snub. This was a shift, a passing of influence, a recognition that the league and the sport had moved into a new phase, and not everyone was equipped to move with it. What remained was the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Was this the end of Aya Wilson's grip on elite basketball, or just the beginning of something far more uncomfortable? From the outside, it looked like a shocking snub. Inside the room, it looked inevitable. Team USA's decision wasn't driven by emotion, narratives, or public pressure. It was driven by something far less visible and far more important: risk management. When you represent a country on the world stage, talent alone isn't enough. Coaches don't just ask who can score. They ask who can survive chaos without becoming it. That's where Aya Wilson's profile began to fracture. For 2 years, selectors had quietly tracked more than box scores. They documented interactions, reactions, tone, body language, how players spoke about teammates and competitors when cameras were on, and when they weren't. These evaluations weren't about catching anyone slipping. They were about identifying who would elevate the group when everything felt hostile and unstable. And Wilson kept giving them reasons to hesitate, not because she wasn't elite, but because she struggled when the environment stopped reinforcing her status. The international stage does something brutal to athletes. It removes familiarity. Crowds don't cheer your name. Officials don't recognize your resume. Media doesn't protect your image. Everything becomes neutral or actively resistant. In those moments, emotional regulation matters as much as physical skill. Wilson's reactions during adversity told a concerning story. When calls didn't go her way, frustration lingered. When narratives shifted, resentment surfaced. When attention moved elsewhere, the response wasn't curiosity or recalibration. It was resistance. That resistance didn't need to be loud to be dangerous. It only needed to be consistent. Compare that to Caitlin Clark. Clark had already experienced something most veterans never do: constant scrutiny without institutional protection. She was criticized, doubted, overanalyzed, and questioned from the moment her popularity exploded. And yet, she never lashed out, never framed success as owed, never treated attention as something to defend. That resilience wasn't accidental. It was evidence. To selectors, Clark looked like someone who could absorb pressure without redirecting it toward teammates. Someone who wouldn't fracture chemistry when adversity hit. Someone whose confidence wasn't dependent on validation. That made her safer. And safety matters more than dominance when margins are thin. Team USA had lived through chemistry disasters before. They'd watched stacked rosters underperform because one personality couldn't coexist with shared responsibility. They'd seen how ego, even justified ego, can poison preparation, trust, and execution faster than any opponent. They weren't willing to repeat that mistake. Wilson's past achievements didn't disappear. They just stopped being protective. Legacy became context, not currency. And once that shift happens, there's no appeal process. The coaches didn't view the decision as punishment. They viewed it as alignment. Alignment with a future where leadership looks different. Where stars don't command silence, they command belief. Where influence is earned daily through behavior, not banked through history. Clark represented that future. Her willingness to defer. Her openness to learning. Her calm under scrutiny. Her ability to generate excitement without demanding control. All of it signaled someone who could thrive inside a collective without needing to dominate it. Wilson, on the other hand, still needed the environment to revolve around her. And that need was incompatible with international reality. The truth most fans don't want to hear is this: elite rooms aren't fair, they're functional. They don't reward who deserves something emotionally. They reward who fits the mission right now. And in that moment, Wilson didn't. What sealed it wasn't the roster decision itself. It was what followed. Instead of recalibration, there was fallout. Instead of quiet resolve, there was narrative scrambling. Instead of internal accountability, there were external explanations. And each response confirmed that the staff hadn't misjudged anything. They hadn't removed a player. They'd avoided a problem. And in doing so, they sent a message that echoed far beyond one tournament. The era of automatic inclusion was over. No resume was bulletproof anymore. No status immune. From now on, every cycle would reset the board. And if that was true for someone like Aya Wilson, then no one was safe. What made this moment so uncomfortable for the league wasn't the roster decision itself. It was what the decision represented. For years, women's basketball operated on an unspoken agreement. Dominance bought stability. If you reached a certain level, MVPs, championships, international success, your place at the top wasn't questioned. You might lose games, but you didn't lose relevance. You didn't lose leverage. You didn't suddenly find yourself competing with the future. That agreement just collapsed. Aya Wilson wasn't pushed aside because she stopped being good. She was pushed aside because the sport stopped organizing itself around singular authority. And once that shift began, everything that once felt permanent became conditional. This is how eras actually end. Not with decline, with overlap. Clark didn't wait for Wilson to fade. She arrived while Wilson was still dominant. That overlap created tension the league wasn't prepared to navigate openly. Veterans felt threatened. New fans felt energized. Media felt torn between respect and momentum. And institutions, like Team USA, had to choose. What they chose wasn't youth over experience. It was trajectory over history. That distinction matters. Trajectory asks where the game is going. not where it's been. It prioritizes adaptability, emotional intelligence, and cultural reach just as much as production. It favors players who expand the audience instead of policing it. Clark checked those boxes naturally. She didn't need to posture. She didn't need to defend her relevance. The numbers did it for her. The crowds did it for her. The engagement did it for her. Even internationally, fans who had never followed the WNBA recognized her immediately. That kind of pull is impossible to manufacture. Wilson's influence, by contrast, was deeply rooted in existing structures. Longtime fans, domestic systems, familiar officiating, established hierarchies. None of that disappears overnight, but none of it guarantees survival when the audience shifts. And the audience did shift. Women's basketball stopped being a niche conversation among dedicated followers and became a mainstream curiosity. With that came different expectations. Faster pacing, bigger personalities, less patience for territorial behavior. Clark fit that environment instinctively. Wilson didn't. That doesn't make Wilson wrong. It makes her misaligned. And misalignment at the elite level is unforgiving. What's rarely discussed is how players react when they realize the system no longer bends toward them. Some adapt quietly. Some reinvent themselves. Others double down on authority, hoping pressure restores order. Wilson appeared to choose the third path. Her frustration wasn't just about one decision. It was about losing control over how the story was being told. For years, she had been the narrator of her own dominance. Now the story was moving faster than she could shape it. Clark never tried to take that power. She simply existed within the moment. And that's why the shift felt so brutal. Because no one likes losing ground to someone who isn't even fighting you. Behind closed doors, conversations began changing tone. Not just about Wilson, but about the league as a whole. Coaches, executives, and sponsors started asking different questions. Not who has the best resume, but who moves the needle. Not who's earned this, but who carries this forward. Those are dangerous questions for established stars, because they don't have sentimental answers. They have pragmatic ones. Clark's presence forced a reckoning the league had postponed for years. It exposed the gap between performance and influence, between dominance and connection, between authority and relevance. And once that gap becomes visible, it never fully closes again. Wilson's reaction, even if understandable, accelerated the shift. It framed her as someone protecting territory instead of shaping the future. That perception stuck, regardless of intent. Meanwhile, Clark's restraint continued to amplify her appeal. Every time she refused to engage, she looked bigger. Every time she focused on team language, she looked safer. Every time she absorbed pressure without complaint, she looked ready. Ready for what? Not just international play. Leadership. The kind of leadership that doesn't demand recognition, but receives it anyway. And that terrified people who had built careers believing leadership was something you asserted. The truth is, this wasn't a moment, it was a warning. A warning to every veteran who believed longevity alone guaranteed relevance. A warning to anyone who thought the game would slow down to accommodate comfort. A warning that the next generation wouldn't wait politely for permission. Clark wasn't the exception. She was the signal. And once that signal was sent, the consequences rippled outward. Players started recalibrating how they spoke publicly, how they positioned themselves, how they responded to attention shifting away from them. Some adapted, some didn't, and some still haven't realized what's already happened. Because power rarely announces its transfer. It just stops responding to those who assume it belongs to them. The hardest truth for elite athletes to accept isn't decline. It's irrelevance. Decline at least feels familiar. You can point to injuries, age, mileage. You can tell yourself the body gave out before the will did. Irrelevance is different. It arrives while you're still capable, still productive, still respected, just no longer centered. That's what made this moment so destabilizing for Aya Wilson. She hadn't slipped. She hadn't vanished. She hadn't become ineffective. And yet, decisions were being made that no longer revolved around her presence. Meetings happened without her input. Futures were planned without her as the focal point. The system she once anchored had quietly rebalanced. That's a psychological shock few champions are trained to handle. For years, Wilson's identity had been reinforced by affirmation. Coaches deferred. Media praised. Officials responded. Fans rallied. Those signals don't just validate performance. They shape self-perception. They create an internal expectation that influence is permanent. But permanence is an illusion in evolving sports. Once the audience grows, the power dynamics change. The league stops catering to insiders and starts responding to outsiders. New fans don't arrive carrying reverence for old hierarchies. They arrive chasing excitement. They attach themselves to what feels alive right now. Caitlin Clark represented that immediacy. She didn't need protection. She didn't need context. She didn't need explanation. Her appeal was intuitive. People didn't debate why she mattered, they felt it. That instinctive connection terrified established power structures. Because it can't be negotiated with. Wilson's legacy still mattered. But legacy alone doesn't move markets, doesn't sell futures, doesn't expand reach. It preserves. It doesn't ignite. And Team USA wasn't building a museum. They were building a machine. A machine designed to operate under maximum pressure, maximum scrutiny, and minimal margin for emotional error. Every selection had to answer one question. Who survives when everything turns hostile? That question exposed a fault line. Wilson's reactions to loss of control suggested friction. Her discomfort with attention shifting suggested volatility. Not because she was unstable, but because she had never needed to recalibrate publicly before. Clark had. From the moment her rise began, she existed inside controversy. Debates, criticism, expectations that bordered on absurd. And she absorbed it all without demanding the world slow down for her. That composure became her currency. It's why sponsors trusted her. Why coaches trusted her. Why selectors saw her as expandable rather than explosive. She didn't fracture environments, she adapted to them. Wilson, by contrast, was built to dominate environments that reinforced her status. Once reinforcement disappeared, the cracks showed. Not dramatically, not destructively, but unmistakably. Every frustrated glance, every loaded phrase, every attempt to reassert hierarchy reminded decision-makers that her leadership model depended on being centered. International competition doesn't allow that. You don't get to be centered when representing a country. You become interchangeable by design. Systems matter more than stars. Chemistry matters more than resume. Emotional restraint matters more than reputation. Wilson struggled with that inversion. And the more she struggled, the clearer it became that this wasn't a temporary misalignment. It was a structural one. The tragedy is that none of this had to happen publicly. Had Wilson recalibrated early, embraced the shift, repositioned herself as a stabilizer rather than a defender, the outcome might have been different. Influence doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes when it resists reality. Instead, the resistance became the story. And once the story becomes bigger than the player, control is gone. Clark never needed to say a word. Her presence did all the talking. Every time she stepped onto the floor without apology. Every time she accepted scrutiny without complaint. Every time she framed opportunity as responsibility instead of reward. Those moments accumulated. And eventually, they outweighed decades of precedent. This wasn't about disrespecting greatness. It was about redefining what greatness looks like moving forward. Aya Wilson became the first visible casualty of that redefinition. Not because she failed, but because she couldn't transition fast enough. And what makes this moment so unsettling for the rest of the league is that it won't be the last. Because once institutions prove they're willing to move on from untouchable figures, everyone else starts listening differently. Power almost never collapses in public. It fades quietly, behind closed doors, in meetings you're no longer part of and decisions you assumed would include you. By the time the headlines catch up, the shift has already happened. That's what makes this story so uncomfortable. Aya Wilson didn't lose her talent. She didn't lose her work ethic. She didn't lose her place in history. What she lost was alignment with where the game decided to go next. And in elite sports, that's the one thing you can't afford to lose. Caitlin Clark didn't take anything from her. She didn't campaign for it. She didn't demand it. She didn't challenge authority directly. She simply fit the moment better, emotionally, culturally, and structurally. And when institutions choose between resistance and momentum, they almost always follow momentum. That's the lesson hiding beneath all the noise. Legacy no longer guarantees insulation. Dominance no longer guarantees control. And influence, once lost, doesn't come back just because it feels unfair. The sport didn't reject Wilson. It outgrew the version of leadership she represented. And that's the part most people miss. This wasn't about one roster. It wasn't about one accusation. It wasn't even about Caitlin Clark. It was about a league crossing a threshold. a threshold where audiences expand faster than hierarchies, where adaptability matters more than tenure, where emotional discipline outweighs entitlement, and where stars are judged not just by how great they are, but by how they respond when they're no longer the center of gravity. Some will adapt, some will resist, and some won't realize what's happened until the doors stop opening. The real question isn't whether this decision was right or wrong. It's who's next. Because once the system proves it can move on from someone untouchable, no one is untouchable anymore. If you want more breakdowns like this, stories that go deeper than headlines and explain why power shifts before the world notices, make sure you're subscribed. This is where the real stories in basketball get told.